G'day humans, it's Josh versus the news, a little weekly check-in about some of the stories that are being reported perhaps in ways that we might find suboptimal in the mainstream press, or stories that you haven't even paid any attention to. What's going on this week, ladies and gents? I'd like to hear your thoughts and chat with me in the comments. Here in Sydney, there isn't much else to talk about, which is somewhat strange because it's not like we were unaware that jihadist attacks or anti-Semitic attacks were on the cards. It just sort of feels weird when your city and your community and your safe space is the lottery ball that gets picked out of the vast cosmic bucket and becomes the place that the rest of the world is going to be talking about because of some atrocity. I definitely have some thoughts about anti-Semitism, about the Australian government, about the Australian culture's response and what we could have done better and what we can do better moving forward. But I also don't want to overlook the big story of the week, which is on everyone's mind, which is the great snail theft in France, where shop owners say that thieves have stolen a half a ton of snails from a boutique snail breeding house, not quite the heist of the Louvre, but in this little village in northeastern France, more than $100,000 worth of escargot were stolen from a local farm just as the prime holiday snail eating season began. So apparently, the French eat about 20 million kilos, 37 million pounds of snails every year. There are a lot of small snail farmers in France. A lot of the consumption happens around Christmas and New Year. There are lots of holiday escargot recipes in French magazines. And now one of the biggest escargot farms in France has been knocked off. An inside job. I mean, not from the farm themselves, but obviously someone who knows the escargot industry, because they were able to go in and pilfer both the breeding snails and also the frozen snails. So thoughts and prayers with the snail eaters of France at this difficult time. The other big issue that a couple of people are already asking about in the comments is Rob Reiner's death. Yeah. Errol says, what does Josh think? Well, what does Josh think of the Knives Out movies? And in honor of Rob Reiner's passing, what would he say is Rob Reiner's favorite work? Loved Rob Reiner, a titan of Hollywood. I think probably, I mean, it's a toss-up for me because Spinal Tap is obviously one of the great films of its genre and set the stage for the mockumentary comedy satire. But I think When Harry Met Sally takes the cake as one of the great, although there's also A Few Good Men, which is one of the greatest kind of legal dramas ever. But I think When Harry Met Sally, the chemistry between the two of them is absolute perfection. If you haven't seen it in 5 or more years, go back and watch it. I've been flip-flopping around about what I think about the causes of the Bondi attack. Obviously, my initial first draft was released on the pod the day after with barely fleshed out thoughts. And I have always felt that it's a little bit too neat to simply say that marches on behalf of Gazans and anti-Israel protests and pro-Palestinian activism has created a climate in which this sort of thing is possible. Because it's hard for me to imagine someone who was apparently on the radar of Australian intelligence 6 years ago when he was 18 years old. This is the surviving alleged shooter, giving up his commitment to ISIS simply because people weren't quite as sympathetic to Gazans. But that's not really the question. The question has become, for me, and which I think Australians should focus on more than they currently are, because the conversation here seems to be turning quickly to gun control. It's interesting, actually, when people don't want to talk about the root causes of something, they change the subject to something else. And it's interesting that in the United States, when there's a mass shooting, because gun control is so controversial in the States, Americans quickly change the subject away from gun control to talking about mental health or talking about crime or talking about, they don't want to touch gun control. Here, gun control is the easy, safe thing that politicians want to start talking about because they don't want to talk about the actual complicated and difficult and controversial and internally divisive thing, which is jihadism and anti-Semitism. We have lived in an environment in which it has been impossible for public figures to simply denounce Jew hatred without also going on to say, and Islamophobia and all forms of bigotry, as if there's some way in which it would be unseemly to point out an obvious fact about the community that is being uniquely targeted in the period over the course of the Gaza war. And it's not the case that people become committed to ISIS or that ISIS sympathizers become encouraged to pull off attacks simply because the Prime Minister doesn't speak out more fully against anti-Semitism. But it is plausible that it's the case that there's a whole set of subtle permission structures that exist that go into turning the dial towards action or inaction in the minds of extremists. That when people feel like there is broad latent support for their basic worldview, that just ratchets things up a notch and makes it slightly more likely that they'll take their deranged fantasies from inside their head into the actual real world. And I think that's where the blame lies with the Australian government and the broader Australian community, where there's been a kind of a laziness, a sloppiness, a confusion, really, about differentiating cleanly between Australian policy and attitudes towards the war in Gaza and Israel's many failings, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how Jews and non-Jews, Muslims and Arabs and non-Muslims and non-Arabs should all get together and live with each other here in a multicultural country like Australia. And the past 5 days have clarified my thinking on that. That it's not that hard, actually, to differentiate between what is free political speech and what is tacit intimidation or incitement. Saying that Palestine should be free is free political speech. Marching in protest against the Gaza war is free political speech. Criticizing Israel for its occupation and for the blockade of Gaza and for the settlements is free political speech. Why was it not possible to say those things without also gathering together very large numbers of people who were very agitated in a hostile environment and who also carried slogans, placards, and chants that had nothing to do with Israeli policy? Things like globalize the Intifada or from the river to the sea, by any means necessary. Things like from the river to the sea, which might feel benign to people who aren't very in the weeds about this stuff, and which just seems like, well, that's what Palestinians want, so why shouldn't Palestinians have it? They are a dispossessed people. You do have to understand, and one ought to have been able to understand since October 2023, that for people who have friends, family, and co-religionists who were just slaughtered in a jihadist attack, whatever the underlying causes of that, even if Israeli misdeeds gave rise to the frustrations and the underlying conditions that led to October 7th, in the wake of the actual attack, which was horrendously bloodthirsty and, suffice it to say, not targeted towards Israeli military institutions, but towards the Jewish people, to go around saying, from the river to the sea, by any means necessary, Palestine will be free, is to say that the little strip of land 1/3 the size of Tasmania, on which half the world's Jews live, that entire area should be consumed by a new Arab Muslim state, and given the way that Jews, not to mention women and gays and entrepreneurs and dissidents, are treated in most Arab Muslim states, it's understandable that people who aren't super pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist would find that to be something of a veiled threat. Is it just free political speech to say from the river to the sea, by any means necessary, Palestine will be free? Or is it, in the wake of a jihadist slaughter of Jews on October 7th, also a veiled form of intimidation by saying, someday, as soon as possible, preferably, there will be no safe space for Jews. The one Jewish safe haven in the world will be overrun. Not to mention globalize the Intifada, which, I mean, many people have said it in the past week. I don't need to reiterate it, but the Intifada has been globalized. So congratulations. If you were marching at protests alongside people waving banners that said globalize the Intifada, you have your wish. Well done. Many of the people who I think were involved in what Jews felt were anti-Semitic marches and protests and chants are not bad people, and they didn't understand the context. They just saw the horrors that were going on in Gaza and were appalled, as was I, and they wanted to do something. The problem is, if you find yourself marching in lockstep with tens of thousands of people, all chanting the same thing, and those are things that you didn't write, whose implications you don't understand, about a subject on which you're not an expert, which you know a minority says it finds intimidating, it is possible that you're not elevating the discourse. It is possible that you should think twice. And if it's all a bit in the weeds and you can't be expected to know what the overtones of From the River to the Sea mean for Jewish Australians, you have two terrific options as an uninformed bystander. You can either shut up and stay home, or, as well as talking to people who are outraged about Gaza, you could also talk to Jewish people and see how they feel. And then you could decide what to do. And we didn't do that on the whole as Australians. We saw the images. We wanted to perform the correct message on social media. We wanted to show solidarity. And we couldn't be bothered inquiring whether or not some of those protests were coordinated or funded by the Iranian intelligence services, which we subsequently found out from British police and US intelligence that they almost certainly were. They certainly were in other Western countries, in the UK and in the US. There was an extraordinary level of coordination and logistical sophistication on those relentless protests week after week after week. More Australians attended them than there are Jews in Australia. Supposedly disparate protests all over the country had all the same kinds of signs and the same kinds of slogans. So it's entirely possible that they were not exclusively natural grassroots expressions of genuine Australian concern, but that well-meaning Australians were being played by theocrats and jihadists. Now, well-meaning Australians shouldn't be expected to know the difference about that. We're not all experts. But you know who should know the difference? The Prime Minister and Australian intelligence. Well, Australian intelligence does seem to have known the difference, because the Australian Prime Minister booted the Iranian ambassador out of the country earlier this year when the intelligence services realised that a sequence of violent anti-Semitic attacks, firebombings of schools and cafes and synagogues, had actually, which we thought were homegrown, presumably Arab Muslim terrorism, turned out to be Iranian, I don't want to say false flag operations, but they were proven to be the work of Iran. So once that becomes clear, you would expect people who are guiding the country, who are supposed to be shepherding the country and keeping us all on the same page, to be more courageous about standing up to noisy, angry people in the community who vastly outnumber Jewish Australians, and to take a kind of a pastoral role almost and say, listen, I know things are hot right now, and it's okay to express these kinds of specific ideas against the state of Israel. It is not okay to ride a horse along the beach waving a Palestinian flag. Like, that is not really free political speech. What point are you making exactly, except to evoke sort of medieval Arabian barbarism by riding a horse? That is going to land for Jewish Australians as an act of intimidation. It obviously did, because Jewish Australians were screaming from the rooftops for the past 2 years that there were whole chunks of their own cities that they felt too intimidated to pass through when there were the Gaza protests going on, because they would be heckled. And they did fear for their safety. Not irrationally, they didn't fear microaggressions. They felt genuine fear of having a bottle thrown at their heads or being yelled at with demeaning anti-Semitic remarks, regardless of what their position on Israel might have been. It should have been obvious in hindsight that creating that kind of a climate where people who were on the much more extreme end of Jew hatred felt like the rest of the country was basically at their backs would be more likely to act. It's a counterfactual, so we don't know. And I certainly don't absolve the Netanyahu government of responsibility for putting a target on Jews' backs and for increasing anti-Semitism through the sheer callousness of the way that it conducted the war. But the rest of the population also has a role to play and should also be reflecting on the knee-jerk way that they lapped up every example of Gazan disaster porn without trying to contextualize how their behavior might land in a multi-ethnic, multicultural, pluralistic, cosmopolitan country like Australia. How it might fray the ties that our various communities share. It's interesting to look at the headlines. I always find it interesting to look at the headlines of the way that things are reported around the world when something like this happens. Let's take a look at a few of them here. There's one from that's the New York Post. Family from hell: 15 murders, father, son, gunman attack beach festival. Then there's also the New York Times: Sydney carnage targets Jews. The London Times: bloodbath at Bondi Beach. The Daily Express in the UK: the hero of Bondi Beach. And this is where it becomes interesting, because editors of newspapers basically had one of two options. They could either roll with the horrendousness of it, or they could find the silver lining. And it tells you something about the attitudes of different publications and their assumed readership as to which one they chose. So quite a lot of the British press, especially the tabloids, went for the heroic angle. The hero of Bondi Beach, says the Daily Express, as at least 16 people die in a horrific terrorist attack on a Jewish festival, one brave bystander saves many lives. Then the Daily Mail also goes with the hero of the Bondi Beach massacre: incredible courage of shopkeeper who grabbed gun off terrorist in anti-Semitic rampage that killed 15 and injured 42. The Sun in the UK goes the negative angle: Bondi fiends, dad and son, but also with a subheading about hero tackled gunman firing at Jewish event with the banner 15 murdered on Oz Beach. The Independent: an act of evil, 16 dead, including child, in anti-Semitic Bondi Beach gun attack. They devote the entire front page just to photos of the tragedy. The Daily Mirror: horror and heroism at Bondi. They try to have a bob each way, going with both the hero and also the tragedy. Beach terror attack, it says at the top: gunman killed at least 15 during Jewish festival as brave shopkeeper saves others by tackling one of the shooters. The Daily Telegraph in the UK also does both hate and heroism on Bondi. The Metro in the UK says the hero of the Bondi Beach massacre, focusing on the positive news story. Here in Australia, the newspapers were more aligned with obviously just articulating the tragedy of it all. The Australian saying Hanukkah terror attack on Bondi Beach, and then the big headline says massacre of Jews. Daily Telegraph in Australia just says "you bastards" as its main headline. I love the Daily Telegraph's headline writers. I think they do an amazing job. You bastards. It's perfect. Attackers had explosives, it says. Cops investigate third person. Astonishing acts of bravery. The Sydney Morning Herald, which is the most read broadsheet in Australia, just says Bondi terror as its headline. Multiple casualties, people forced to flee, 2 in custody. The Herald Sun, which is the Melbourne version of the Daily Telegraph, says Bondi terror massacre. They need to get a better headline writer. They need to get the guy from the telly down to Melbourne to do the Herald Sun, because Bondi terror massacre is nowhere near as good a headline as just "you bastards." The Adelaide Advertiser, which is the other offshoot, slaughter of innocents, but innocence is spelled innocence as in with a C-E, as in we no longer have our innocence, which I think is a clever pun because it articulates quite a lot of what Australians are feeling at the moment. It was certainly the main thing that I felt in the days after, and it was what made me quite emotionally raw, was not just the tragedy of the lives lost, but the sense that this carefree, playful, hedonistic place, by which I mean not only Bondi Beach, but also Australia as a whole, is not immune. That we sort of feel like we're on the other side of the planet from all the big, important, scary things that are going on. There's Ukraine, and there's Trump, and there's Brexit, and there's whatever it might be, but we sort of sit here from on the other side of the globe, eating our popcorn, watching it all go down. And Sunday was a moment when it was like, oh, okay, we are actually still part of the world. Like all of the vast forces of bigotry and jihadism and religious delusion and anti-Semitism and all of that, still, we're in those currents. You know, we may be an eddy in the river, but we're not outside the river. I think those are the headlines, all the headlines that we need to go through. If you have any things that you want to say or that you feel like you need to be heard on, please do chat in the chat. I like seeing them and I like being able to hear what you think. Errol also says, what does Josh think of the Knives Out movies? Because we were talking about Rob Reiner. I think the first one was entertaining. I think the second one was pretty stupid, right? That was the one about that was like a satire of big tech. And then the third one's really good. The third one is a good standalone movie. It's the best, I believe. Crazy Elf says regarding the French snail story, first they came for the Louvre and I said nothing, then they came for the snails. Thank you very much. Good one. And also says 2 political buttons could be pressed after Sunday's attack. You could either go for gun control or immigration. The ALP, meaning the governing Labor Party here in Australia, we're always going to press the gun control button. And the LNP, meaning the Conservative Coalition, the immigration one. That is interesting, but I think it does. I think it misses the fact that gun control is enormously popular in Australia, and talking in uncensored but nonetheless sensitive ways about the challenges of integrating migrant communities and how to have a clever immigration policy that weeds out religious extremists, and how to have a policy on, religious preachers that does not curtail people's freedom of religion, but does clamp down on incitements to violence, is much harder to do. So I'm not even sure that conservatives in Australia are good at it. And part of the problem is that liberals are, by sort of vacating the territory and having uncomfortable conversations about migration and jihadism and religious conservatism and liberalism, we have left the terrain to much worse actors. So you do have a rise in the popularity of far-right people in the Australian political context. You've got people who have been around for a very long time, like Pauline Hanson and Barnaby Joyce, who have always been fearless about making the case that there are reasons to worry about the complexion of the different communities that are coming into this country. And now you've got more right-wing people, or rather more populist anti-immigrant forces, including actual neo-Nazis, who for the first time are appearing on the Australian scene, at least the first time in my lifetime. And if we as liberals can't wrestle openly with the challenges of religious extremism and religious conservatism in a way that is more sophisticated than simply saying, say no to hate, say no to extremism and bigotry. We do not tolerate anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or any... Like, that's just not good enough. It sounds pat. And if we can't actually talk about, okay, well, if there are imams in mosques who are persistently, consistently, reliably indoctrinating young Australians, young Australian Muslims, into a worldview that is anti-enlightenment, that is demeaning to women, that is hysterically obsessed with Jews, that is totally antithetical to gays, and really is fundamentally opposed to the project of Western civilization, that is a problem. And anytime anyone has tried to talk about that, they're accused of being Islamophobic bigots. So we've backed ourselves into something of a corner where the only people who are talking about it are people who are genuine anti-Muslim bigots, instead of the rest of us who should have the stomach to be able to defend liberal democracy, defend pluralism, defend multiculturalism, whilst acknowledging the challenges that holding together a society like Australia's entails. We can talk about Venezuela as well. Is America going to go to war? I think so. But, you know, watch this space, I suppose. On the chat line, Jared says, I can't see how you can make Australian gun laws any better. The attack would have been way more deadly if they had assault weapons. Actually, there's a really interesting podcast out this morning. There's a podcast called If You're Listening, which is produced and hosted by, well, written and hosted by my friend Matt Bevan, who has been on this show before. It's one of the best, it's the best Australian podcast that's not an interview show. Like, it's about the news, it's about international politics mostly, but he looks at Australian gun laws today. And it's interesting because the gun law reforms that were introduced in the 1990s had to divide up guns in a somewhat arbitrary way between Class A, Class B, Class C, and Class D guns. So D was going to be totally outlawed unless you're law enforcement or the army, and A was going to be totally permitted if you had a gun license, and then there are various gradations of licenses in between. But the world of gun technology that existed 30 years ago when these laws came into place has changed enormously. So every time a new gun comes onto the market, it has to be assigned into one of these categories, and the accusation is that successive governments have been asleep at the wheel on doing that, and they've allowed gun companies to essentially assign the ratings themselves without much oversight, and that the spot checks which the gun enforcement agency in Australia was supposed to do about just coming in occasionally on people who have, knocking on the door of people who have gun licenses and making sure that those guns are both still there and also kept properly and safely, that those have massively declined. So the fact that the shooters on Sunday were able to have pump-action rifles, which you could reload incredibly quickly and you could shoot more than 5 rounds out of. The rule was, after the gun law reforms, that you couldn't have semi-automatic weapons. You couldn't have AR-15s, which is what the Port Arthur shooter used, and what so many American shooters use. So you can't have a gun that reloads itself immediately after you fire it. You have to reload it yourself. But pump-action shotguns were permitted as long as you couldn't shoot more than 5 rounds. So you'd shoot, and then you'd go, and then you'd shoot and go, and then shoot, and you could do that 5 times. But magazines that permit more, there are amendments that you can make to these guns. There are new things that gun manufacturers have released, which you can attach to them. And apparently, it now seems like the shooters on Sunday were firing a lot more than 5 in a row without having to load a new magazine. So there is more that you can do if you want to go at that angle. I'm sure that will be the easy thing for Australia to do. I'm sure Australia will just make sure that that its classifications are up to date. Maybe you could require, every 2 years or every year that there's a review from gun experts that the guns that are coming in are being properly classified according to the categories. You could make enforcement more robust. Apparently, there are 260,000 unregistered firearms in Australia, which is crazy. I mean, that means that, what's that, like 1% of the population of the country in guns, which is quite a lot to be unregistered. Errol says on the question of how you talk about hate without sort of diffusing the specificity of anti-Semitism, here in the US after 10/7, there were PSA ads about stopping Jewish hate. 10/7, the 7th of October. Oh, okay, yes, right, round the wrong way. I'm sorry, it's early. Here in the US, after October 7th, there were PSA ads about stopping Jewish hate and had a blue square at the end. After a few months, the ads changed to stop all hate. And I couldn't help but think that if that had ever happened during a Black Lives Matter movement for All Lives Matter, what an uproar there would have been about it. Yes, it's a good analogy. And Jared says that Sunday would have been more like a Christchurch incident if Australia didn't already have such strict restrictions on guns. That's right. In fact, one of the tragedies of the Christchurch massacre, where a far-right white supremacist gunned down all of those Muslims in mosques, was that would have been an Australian attack. He was an Australian guy. He had no connection to New Zealand. It was an Australian who had been radicalised in Europe and online. He'd travelled a lot through Asia. There's actually a really interesting episode of this podcast, of Uncomfortable Conversations, that is, about the background of the Christchurch shooter. Joey Watson is a great young investigative journalist who did a podcast series about it. And it was basically challenging the idea that the Christchurch shooter was a lone wolf, which is the official narrative of the authorities. And Joey's point is, yes, there was no direct logistical support for the Christchurch terrorist, but to say that he was acting alone is to miss this entire soup of far-right white supremacy that is exploding online. It's to misunderstand the potency of 4chan and 8chan and these message boards. It's to miss the rise in far-right Islamophobia and anti-Semitism across Europe. I mean, this guy was radicalized online, but then he literally went and met with multiple groups in Europe on the eastern frontier of the European Union. There are like migrant hunting groups where white nationalists police the border and, try to catch people who are trying to, asylum seekers who are trying to break into Europe, essentially, in places like Hungary. And he was with them, and he knew these people, and he got funding. No, he didn't get funding. He funded, because he was apparently independently wealthy through an inheritance. He was funding right-wing people all over the world, like far, far, far right people. And the reason why he went to New Zealand is because AR-15s were still legal in New Zealand. So he was able to assemble an arsenal the likes of which he wouldn't have been able to acquire in Australia. But had it not been for Australia's gun laws, then yes, what we saw on Sunday, not only what we saw on Sunday would have been much, 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 much worse if there were AR-15s involved, but the Christchurch shooting itself would have taken place somewhere, in Sydney or Melbourne or elsewhere. So on many levels, we should be grateful. I'm certainly grateful for living in a country that has decided that having a lot of guns around is not a price worth paying. Juan says, I'm really concerned about the heavy focus on gun control while anti-Semitism and radicalisation in Australia are being largely ignored. We already have laws intended to prevent this kind of attack, including preventing people with extremist links from getting guns. Yes. And we also have what's the point in having hate speech laws like Australia does if you're not going to use them? This is what's weird. I can understand a free speech argument from libertarian American-style free speech absolutists who say, don't go down the path of trying to impede people's ability to shriek about how we should globalize the Intifada. You need to reason with them, and the best way to combat bad speech is with better speech. But if you're not going to take that approach, and Australia doesn't take that approach, Australia has some of the tightest hate speech laws in the world, where things that can be perceived to denigrate religious groups can get you in trouble, like legally. We don't have a First Amendment. We decide what is allowed to be said and what is not allowed to be said. And well-meaning bureaucrats are often on the other end of deciding what does and doesn't constitute incitement to violence or intimidation. If the shoe was on the other foot and it was another minority that had been being demeaned and intimidated the way that Jews have been, just the sheer aggressiveness, scale, intimidating tone, and kind of wild-eyed sloganeering that had nothing to do with the actual actions of Israel, but sort of constantly, latently threatened the existence of a Jewish homeland and things that Jewish people hold dear. If that had been transposed to another minority, it's hard to imagine that the well-meaning bureaucrats who enforce hate speech laws in Australia wouldn't have noticed and wouldn't have done something. This is sort of the infuriating thing for Jewish people about the way that anti-Semitism expresses itself. It's just subtle enough that it's not obvious if you're not noticing it. It's easy to wave away if you're not sort of primed to notice it. And there's probably some extent to which Jewish people are overly paranoid and interpreting everything as anti-Semitism. You certainly hear it being used as a disingenuous cudgel when pro-Israel people accuse anyone who's criticizing Israel of being anti-Semitic. That's ridiculous. And certainly, as I've said, things like arguing to free Palestine or arguing for a Palestinian state is not anti-Semitic. A majority of Jews wish that there was a Palestinian state, as long as it accepted the existence of Israel alongside it. But once you notice the double standard, it's very hard to ignore. I mentioned on the podcast that I did after the Bondi shooting just some tiny example of how there was another podcast that one of the big centre-left outlets did about anti-Semitism, and they had 3 panelists talking about anti-Semitism, none of whom was Jewish. And I said, can you imagine them talking about anti-gay hate and homophobia and not a single panelist is gay? Or talking about racism towards Muslims, Islamophobia, and not a single Muslim is on the panel. Like, you wouldn't have that oversight. And it's not that the producer is thinking, ooh, I know, let's get the Jews by not inviting them on the panel. It's just that it doesn't occur to them as being necessary because Jews don't count the same way that other minorities count. And that's the way that anti-Semitism manifests itself in the 21st century. No one is so gauche as to talk about how terrible Jews are, but they do talk about how terrible Zionism is, and they do allow people to walk right up to the line and a little bit over it, certainly in terms of their manner, if not their literal words, in creating a climate of intimidation towards Jews that they would not tolerate towards other people. That's how anti-Semitism manifests itself in polite societies like Australia's. There was another example of that this week, which was the ABC's reporting on Bondi. And again, I don't want to bash the ABC because I think it's a cherished institution. It does a lot of great work and it does great news. But on this issue, I would say on the Jewish issue and on the transgender issue, it needs a root and branch clear out. Like, it needs someone at the top to be saying, okay, these are the new standards. This is what we're talking about. If you've got a real bee in your bonnet about Gaza and about the Palestinian issue, that's totally fine and you can stay with us. You just can't write about anti-Semitism in Australia if you're going to allow that to bleed into the coverage. When we're talking about Australia, we're talking about Australia. When we're talking about Jews and Muslims and Arabs and, Christians in Australia, we have to be talking about that phenomenon. And we have to do so in isolation of our concerns about foreign policy or foreign beefs. Because this article in the ABC reported on the Bondi massacre, and this was long after it was clear, it was almost instantly clear that this was an anti-Semitic attack. Everyone else was reporting that it was an anti-Semitic attack. The Premier had already given a press conference saying that this was an act of anti-Semitic terrorist violence. And the headline on the ABC didn't say anything about Jews or anti-Semitism or jihadism or anything. The sub-headline didn't. And it took 19 paragraphs I counted them, 19 paragraphs to mention the fact that, there was a group of Jews there and the shooters seemed to be targeting this Jewish celebration. The first 19 paragraphs were all about Bondi Beach, were all about the mayhem, were all about the casualties, were all about... Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing prima facie wrong with that focus. If, as a news organization, you want to say, the main thing we care about is the fact that one of the most iconic places in Australia has been terrorized, so let's talk about that, then we'll get to the why, but that's less important. The problem is, can you imagine what the coverage would have been if a pair of neo-Nazis had opened fire on a Ramadan celebration at Bondi Beach? I can't imagine it would take them 19 paragraphs to mention the fact that Muslims had been executed in cold blood in Bondi. Again, it's not because they're trying, they don't know they're doing this, the people writing and publishing these articles. They don't think of themselves as having any animosity towards Jews at all. It's just that in the broader culture, Jews don't count the same way other minorities count. And once you notice it, you notice it. And so for this crisis, for this tragedy to take place in a climate in which the Jewish community has been saying over and over and over again, there is a double standard here. We are not feeling like our security concerns are being sufficiently addressed. We believe that there is a spectrum between the lack of concern for Jews mattering. That's the easiest and sort of simplest and most gentle form of anti-Semitism, up to the disproportionate concern with Israel as the world's foremost bogeyman, while we don't care about what's going on to Muslims in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We don't care about what's going on. We don't care about a million ways from Sunday. It's not a problem for us that South Asian Muslims have an ethno-state in Pakistan, or that Arab Muslims have an ethno-state in Saudi Arabia. These are all kosher, but for Jews to have an ethno-state is uniquely barbarous and invalid. So you go from the sort of, you don't really want to, we don't want to talk about Jews. You don't want to put Jews in the headline, or we don't need to invite a Jew when we're talking about anti-Semitism. And you move up the scale of sort of disregard, I would say, to this toleration of a relentless focus on a style of protest during the Gaza war that many Jews found was insufficiently targeted towards Israel's actual misdeeds and was too broadly focused on basically that Jews don't have the same rights that other people do to govern themselves. And then you move up towards the more intimidating acts, the drive-by fire bombings of synagogues, the security concerns that Jewish parents felt, the fairly relentless attacks of spray painting swastikas or fuck Israel on, members of parliament's offices, which happened. This steady drumbeat of course, not tolerated misdeeds, because the police and the government would always say there's no place for hate and this is terrible, but there was no proactive, aggressive, clear-headed sense from the top in Australia that this kind of behaviour cannot go on, and that the singling out of this community because of a foreign war is unacceptable. And then you move up towards actual acts of violence, and once you've got this large landscape of behaviour, it felt inevitable to a lot of Jewish Australians that something much worse would happen. Not something as bad as this, not something as deadly as this, or as visible, as kind of cinematic as this, but that something was going to happen. I'm still wrestling with how much I buy the sliding scale theory, because jihadists are going to jihad regardless of what the conditions are. But I do think that our inability to talk frankly and openly about anti-Semitism in conservative Muslim communities and about illiberalism in all religious extremist faiths is a problem that's going to come back to bite us in the arse. And I don't think that multiculturalism in Australia or anywhere is sustainable unless Liberals can grow a spine and stop kowtowing to the sensitivities of minority groups and feeling like diversity and difference is our strength, and we should never talk about problems that might exist in a traditionally disenfranchised community because that would be punching down. No, that's gone. The whole thing will unravel if we remain as cowed as we are, if we keep tiptoeing around and treading on eggshells. It should not be rocket science morally for small L liberals in Australia, for progressives and also conservatives who defend Western civilization and democracy and the Australian way of life, to say that there is no place in Australia for an imam who preaches anti-Jewish, anti-gay, anti-woman, anti-enlightenment, anti-Western values from the pulpit every single week, and who churns out a steady stream of increasingly radicalized people. That's not, if that's freedom of religion, then we don't want freedom of religion here. Not that kind. There have to be limits. And when it becomes a security concern, it's probably too late. You sort of have to get people somehow on board with the idea that we are all in this together and that we're going to leave our foreign enmities at the water's edge. When we come to Australia, we come to Australia in order to swim and surf and have barbecues and drink beer. We don't do it in order to hash out our ancient feuds and rail against the very values that made this place attractive for people to come to in the first place. Lots of great comments coming in. Tightening firearms laws risks becoming a scapegoat for not dealing with harder problems, says Juan. What did Donald Trump say about the Rob Reiner case? Jeff says, is it possible that even after 10 years of Trump's atrocities, his comments on the Rob Reiner murder were still shocking? Ivan says, Sydney resident here. I've noticed that my friends and colleagues are studiously avoiding mentioning what happened on Sunday. Understandable, I guess. It points to how hard it is to tackle this as a society. I've noticed that as well. It's interesting, isn't it? Quite a lot of non-Jewish people I've found are strangely silent. Just in my friendship groups and colleagues, quite a lot of people have reached out, but a surprising number have not. And I think maybe, there are a few explanations. Maybe they just think, maybe they're just sort of doing what we all do and making it about themselves. This is an attack on Sydney, it's an attack on Bondi, it's an attack on the Australian way of life, and they're not really bothered by the bigotry element of it. Maybe they feel somewhat conflicted or ashamed or equivocal about their aggressive involvement in the movement that will be perceived to have been part of the overall climate that gave rise to this, if they're particularly reflective. Or the worst case scenario is that some little part of them thinks, well, of course this was going to happen. I mean, the bloody Jews, or they don't think Jews, they think the bloody Zionists, because of course you can't think about Jews is too pejorative for polite bigots. The bloody Zionists, of course this was going to happen. There's probably a lot of that going around, honestly. Errol says, this is exactly why free speech rights are necessary. Hate speech laws are whatever the country having them says it is. The hate speech laws are being enforced. They're just being enforced in the way the current government wants it to be. Yeah, it's a good point, Errol, and that is the point that always gets missed. Georgina says, Joshua, a pleasure to listen to. Thank you. Have you read the book The War of Return by Einat? I think you mean Einat. She writes Enid, but it's Einat Wilf. It's great for discussion. Georgina, Einat was on this show, and we had a great debate about it. Not debate, civil conversation about it. I haven't read the book, but I skimmed it before I spoke to her, but I think I got everything that I need from Einat out of our conversation, which people should listen to. Einat's fascinating because her point is basically that, and she was a parliamentarian in Israel. She was a member of the Knesset. She was on the Labour Party, and she opposes settlements in the West Bank. She's a hawk, but a pacifist hawk, if that makes sense. Like she doesn't believe in like a greater Israel. She thinks the occupation is bad, and she feels sympathy for Palestinians. But she also doesn't think that the path forward is by bending over and assuming that love and kumbaya is going to save the day. And her argument, I think I'll do it justice by saying that it basically boils down to the international community and cynical Palestinian and other Arab leaders have had a strategy that's been very successful. It's ultimately been terrible for Palestinians, but it's been successful in isolating Israel, which has been that the right for Palestinian people to return to all of Greater Palestine, all of Israel, in other words, and for all of their descendants to return to their quote-unquote homeland, which means like downtown Tel Aviv, is fundamental, and that the only just resolution will be a Palestine from the river to the sea. And her argument is, had they been conciliatory from the start and understood that nobody gets the whole enchilada, and Israel wanted its little patch, and then there was going to be the Arab side of things, which was going to be Palestine, and then the Arabs immediately invaded, and then back and forth. We can go over the history a million times, but basically on 3 major occasions between the foundation of Israel in the 40s and then up through to 1973, the Arab states, on behalf of the Palestinians, whose national identity was only really forming in the wake of the creation of Israel, as a subset of the broad Arab Muslim population of the region, had they, agreed to at least rhetorically, the idea of a Palestinian state living alongside Israel, then there would never have been a problem, and there would be no occupation, and there would have been no blockade of Gaza, and there would be no Hamas, and Palestinians would have had a state long ago. So that the framing of the whole thing as being like Jews came parachuting in and they dispossessed people is so stuck in like the 1940s that it's just laughable. There were lots of Jews there. The majority of Jews in Israel are still from that region. They're not people who came from Europe. They're Middle Eastern Jews. You can trace the lineage of the Jews back thousands of years. The kingdom of King David was there. If you dig up artifacts archaeologically in Israel, you find ancient Jewish civilizations there. That state got created, and yes, there was bloodshed and dispossession, as there is with the creation of all states, but there was also not just a willingness, but an obvious acceptance, because Israel was not in possession of the West Bank or Gaza when it was created, and for decades those things were occupied by Jordan and Egypt, respectively. And so Einat's point is, if it were the case that there'd ever been any rhetorical willingness on the Arab side to accept that the Jews are not going anywhere, then none of this would have happened. And so all of the sort of misdeeds and calamities that have happened ever since can be brought back to that. I find that a little bit convenient for the Israeli side to say, because it absolves Israel of its responsibility in failing to create conditions in Palestine that make it possible for the green shoots of civil society to emerge and for sane leaders to emerge. It's not helpful to constantly keep building Israeli towns illegally in the West Bank. It's not helpful to divide and conquer Palestinian leadership between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in order to keep them splintered. But I think Einat's broader worldview is correct, which is that there's way too much focus globally and in opposition, in Gazan marches, on the Israeli side of the responsibility here, as if Israel is always supposed to have a perfect solution to the problem. and no recognition of the intransigence of the other side and the fact that the terrible situation which Gazans are in is largely of the, I don't want to say their own creation because that sounds a bit cruel since most of them are under 15 or whatever. But, well, not most of them, a lot of them. But it is the creation of Arab leaders, of Arab autocrats, of Hamas, of international institutions which have pandered to the Palestinian delusion that someday they will return to Israel proper. Josh writes, Mitch, as someone who's keen to dial down the volume on identity, do you think the way the media covers Jews should actually be the way they cover other minorities, so the focus is on the universal rather than the particular? I'm not sure I quite understand that, Mitch. I think, yeah, I understand. So if we're going to... Right, so in the case of like a news organization like the public broadcaster burying the lead on the on the anti-Semitism angle, and instead going full bore on the massacre angle, and then only getting to the fact that it was Jews 19 paragraphs later, would it be better for them to also do that if there was an attack, a Ramadan attack, for example, by neo-Nazis on Muslims, or would it be better to headline both? I think you headline both. I mean, I think you have to... I don't think that being against identity politics means that you need to pretend that people who are motivated by identity politics, as racists and white supremacists and jihadists are, don't exist and aren't motivated by that. But I do think that it would be better if we could all replace our proximate identities at the top of our hierarchy, our ranking hierarchy, with the identity of being human, and then maybe Australian, and then maybe Jewish or Muslim. Whereas at the moment, the Jewish or Muslim seems to be at the top of the pile, and then comes Australian, and then somewhere else comes human. I'm talking about for extremists here, obviously, not for the majority of people. I think the majority of people are appalled by what happened and don't want to play the identity politics game unless it's in a fulfilling way. The issue of anti-Semitism, writes Praetorian, is a component of a larger conspiratorial way of thinking of the world. It doesn't conform to the left-wing frame of oppressor-oppressed. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, the reason why it's difficult for people who aren't on the lookout for anti-Semitism to recognize anti-Semitism when it subtly expresses itself in, overly intimidating Gaza marches that, Jewish people find not to be merely a rational critique of Israeli policy, but something darker, or the way that the media covers anti-Semitism by always insisting on also throwing into to that grab bag all other kinds of bigotry. Those kinds of phenomena are, I think, easier to propagate because of the sort of social justice worldview where you want your minority to be really shat upon in order to be worthy of your sympathy. But the point that David Baddiel makes in his book Jews Don't Count, which is a really important read and a great, really interesting read, is simply that, okay, you could say, well, all right, Jews are powerful, therefore they don't need our sympathy. Okay, well, what does powerful mean? You mean that they're rich, they're not poor? Yeah, okay, rich Jews have money in Australia. Well, okay, I mean, Indians have money in Australia. Koreans have money in Australia. You would never say that a wealthy Indian doctor who is a victim of a racist attack, or, even if it's not an attack, if it's just racism, he's just, he's parked at the lights and someone crosses the crosswalk in front of him and says, go eat some curry, you bloody Indian bastard, or something. The fact that he's rich does not mean that that's not racism. And the fact that the Jewish population isn't poor doesn't mean that hatred against them, even if it's thinly veiled, isn't anti-Semitism. I'm not quite sure what, maybe there's something about the history of colonialism that makes Jewish people seem like they're less worthy of status as a disenfranchised community. I suppose They're overrepresented in the arts and the media, so you can't say that they don't have a mouthpiece for their worldview. They're well connected, so you can't say that they don't have influence. But in each of these cases, you can find other minority communities, even if it's just people, like gay people, for example, who are also overrepresented in the arts and the media, who are also well connected and influential in terms of being out and proud gays. So there are lots of sub-communities who we recognize can be victims of bigotry and who deserve our attention and care, who are not like the bottom of the barrel of most disenfranchised and shat upon people in the history of the universe. It's only when it comes to Jews that the relative privilege of Jews is regarded as a reason for their not needing our concern. And if any of that were the case, if any such thinking were valid prior to October 7th, surely the events of the past couple of years have proven to us that whatever privileges we think Jewish people in Australia and around the world have, those do not protect them from acts of intimidation, vandalism, graffiti, and violence. I mean, you just have to look at the amount of security that needs to be imposed around any Jewish place of worship, or the lengths which Jewish people have to go to hide themselves from the mainstream, including taking off visible signs of their religion and so on, to understand that they are not immune from prejudice. So I don't quite understand why this colonizer, colonized, victim, oppressor, privileged, disadvantaged narrative can be seen to trump the lived reality of what is happening to Jewish people on the ground. But I think the point about that commenter makes about conspiracy thinking is also really interesting. I mean, the amount of conspiracy thinking is just mind-boggling. Like, especially, at the risk of sounding like I'm singling out a community, like, let's just say the radical Muslim community is not great at resisting conspiracies, especially when it comes to the Jews. It was seconds after news of the attack broke that there was stuff about how it was probably an Israeli plot, because, it was a false flag operation. And, I've traveled through Egypt and Lebanon, and I've met a lot of people who are just convinced that 9/11 was an inside job, 9/11 was Mossad, like the Jews are up to everything. Like, maybe this comes partly from living in either dysfunctional or authoritarian states where you just sort of don't trust anything, so you're much more conspiracy-minded. But it is wild that something as patently obvious as what happened on Sunday can immediately get spun into insane conspiracy theories. And of course, there's a whole sort of white nationalist strain of conspiracy thinking on this as well. You only have to look at Pizzagate and all that nonsense. And certainly there have been right-wing websites in the United States saying that this was a false flag operation as well. There was a photo going around of one of the victims of the attack on Sunday. He survived, but there's a photo that he took a selfie of his face covered in blood while he was lying on the grass, and then there was another photo of him, and he's sitting cross-legged on the ground, and someone is applying something to his face. His face is covered in blood, and he's laughing, he's smiling. He survived, obviously, and this person is applying something to his face, and this photo went around and is being used as evidence that the blood is being applied to his face by a makeup artist. And you can tell that it's him. There's the photo of him on the ground, the selfie, right after the attack, covered in blood. And then there's this other photo of him laughing as the blood is being applied by a makeup artist. Now, what had happened was that after the attack, he was being treated by a medic and he was relieved that it was over, and they were having a joke in the trauma of the moment, and the medic was wiping the blood off his face, not putting blood on his face. But you can see how, like, we are just in a miasma now of nonsense. I mean, photos can be taken out of context, they can be generated by AI. It's all the more reason to make sure that you're careful about not trusting anything that you see on social media and only getting your media from reputable sources like me. Praetorian says, wokeism takes the same fallacies and self-sealing hypotheses as anti-Semitism and applies them to a hierarchy of identities. It's difficult to fight anti-Semitism as a leftist if you'd be fighting against the same arguments you've been making for years. Yeah, there's probably a bit of cognitive dissonance there. Another person says, people resent Jews for being successful, so people get schadenfreude when bad things happen to them. Yeah, there might be a bit of that. And Cheryl writes, non-Jewish Australian here, have lost friends over my outspoken concern about growing anti-Semitism over the past 2 years. We'll probably lose more now. I totally agree with Josh Frydenberg. Thank you, Cheryl. That's nice of you to say, and it's nice to know that there are non-Jewish Australians who understand the crisis. Josh Frydenberg, who, full disclosure, happens to be a friend of mine, an old family friend, and I respect him greatly, was the Treasurer of Australia. He's much more pro-Israel than I am. That's fine. And I think he's been speaking a lot of sense over the course of the past 2 years about the listlessness of the Australian leaders in responding to anti-Semitism, in understanding how a lot of the messaging around opposition to the Gaza war was landing. Again, nothing to do with specifics about, brutality in Gaza or about Israel's occupation or anything. We're talking about a relentless barrage of extremely aggressive messaging from mobs about essentially saying that it is inevitable and desirable that Jews will be wiped out of the Middle East. That is the way that things like globalize the Intifada and from the river to the sea by any means necessary. That's what they mean in the context of the Palestinian-Israel conflict. It may not be what the people who are marching across the harbour bridge intend them to mean or think that they mean, but many of the people who were organising that march and who were bringing the signs are fully aware of what they mean to Jewish people, and they are fully comfortable with that level of confrontation. I think that's about it. I don't want to go into. We'll go into Venezuela another time, shall we? Do we want to talk about America going to war with Venezuela? I'm not sure that it's the most pressing of our concerns. I'll leave you with an interesting tidbit of information, equally depressing, from the Manhattan Institute, which found that the number of Republicans in America who agree with the statement that the Holocaust of Jews in Nazi Germany was greatly exaggerated or didn't happen, as historians describe, is 37%. 37%, more than a third of Republicans think the Holocaust was greatly exaggerated. And the same report claims that this view was held by 77% of Hispanic Republican voters, 66% of black Republican voters, and 54% of Republican men aged under 10. So if you're a conservative in America over the age of 50, you're still on board with the Holocaust happened. If you're under 50, a majority of Republicans under 50 think that it was greatly exaggerated. Lastly, my apologies for forgetting Princess Bride. My producer is very angry at me. He wrote Princess Bride with 2 exclamation points and 3 question marks when I was saying Rob Reiner's greatest movies. Okay, maybe I have to go back and watch it. I was a kid. Great film. But, with Rob Reiner, we're only picking from great films. They're all great. But when Harry Met Sally is it's gold. It's total gold. I hope you guys are okay. My love goes out to everybody out there. Take care of yourselves this week. Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and I'll see you shortly. Thanks.